Hello, and welcome everyone to today's episode of the Kianistan podcast. Joining us today, we have Professor Jamal Wakim from Lebanese University, Beirut in Lebanon. Professor Wakim is a professor of history and international relations. Professor Wakim, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Great to have you with us. Professor, to start with, I've got a couple of questions that often come to mind. And as you're a professor of history and international relations, I think you would be ideally suited maybe to help me out with these two questions. Firstly, why is it that we have these Western imposed wars in the Middle East that kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of Arabs, and there's no consequences? And secondly, why is it that after such a long history of resistance, the West Asia still hasn't been able to break free from the influence of these Western powers?
Well, the Middle East are, to be more accurate, the Arab-Islamic region has been in conflict with the West for too long. And over the past 2 centuries, the West, due to several reasons, has been able to infiltrate and impose its hegemony over the majority of the Arab and Muslim countries. And this was also part of a greater, let's say, plan or development that have enabled Western Europe and later on the United States to impose its hegemony over large parts of the world. Some regions were able to free themselves from this hegemony over the past century, including mainly China and Russia. And now, because the United States considers that it has to besiege and encircle these Eurasian powers, it's trying to control the outlets in regions that could give China and Russia access to maritime trade routes. Well, the Arab world have been trying to break free from this hegemony, and there were several attempts over the past 2 centuries, most important of which was the one that was led by Mehmet Ali Pasha of Egypt in the first half of the 19th century. Another attempt was the liberation movement led by Nasser of Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s. And thereafter, there were some Islamic powers, such as Iran, that have been trying to break free and resist Western hegemony. In retaliation, the West have used Israel as a tool to manipulate and to superimpose itself over Arab countries, block their attempts to freedom and to be free from Western hegemony. So Egypt, after the death of Nasser, had to abide by Western hegemony through the Camp David Agreement. Other powers, such as Iraq, Syria, and Algeria, have been subject to indiscriminate wars. Iraq was destroyed back in 1991, then invaded in 2003. Algeria have been subject to a war by proxy, waged by the United States via some radical Islamist groups during the 1990s. And lately, what we saw in Syria, with the collapse of the Syrian regime at the hands of groups that were supported by Israel and by Turkey, which is a member of NATO. With this was achieved actually in coordination with the British intelligence and, of course, the United States. So now we have certain powers that are trying to play independent roles. Mostly, or most important, is Iran. We also have Pakistan as a power. However, Pakistan is under Western and mainly American pressure that is directed against it via this alliance between Israel and India. And Erdogan of Turkey is playing a complementary role to the West in the region, trying to, let's say, be a partner in a Western run Middle East with Israel as the pole of the region, while the United States are promising him a prominent role in Central Asia as a substitute for the loss of influence in certain parts of the Middle East. So this is the situation in general, and the reason why the West, the Arab-Islamic countries, or most of them, were not capable of breaking free from Western hegemony.
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you, yeah, for such a broad analysis. There's a number of these issues that I'd like to talk to you, especially trade corridors and great power rivalries that you've written quite a lot about, and we'll talk about that in this conversation later. I saw you also, I think it was in 2024, you wrote an article about how the West and especially America uses Takfiri and jihadi organizations to further, geopolitical ambitions in the Middle East and to weaken its rivals. After what's happened in Syria, how do you see this this kind of duplicit role of the West, where they, on one hand, supporting and creating the jihadi movement, and on the other hand, they're creating Islamophobia as a result of what these organizations are doing as well?
Well, using Takfiri groups and under the banner of what they call radical Islam or radical political Islam have been the trend in the West since the 1930s and 1940s. Because the British, this was mainly a British contribution, thought that promoting certain groups under the banner of Islam or political Islam could attract the youth on one hand and simple-minded people on another hand, in order to use these groups as tools against any independent trend, for example. So, and mainly during the 1940s, after the collapse of Germany, Nazi Germany, there were many thousands of volunteers, Muslim volunteers, who were fighting alongside Germany. And we remember the role of Mufti Haj Amin Husseini of Palestine, who played a prominent role in recruiting these youth. So the British and the Americans used the Nazis as a tool against communism during the Cold War, and they thought that they could do the same with these Islamist youth, or this youth that have been affiliated with political Islam in the Arab-Islamic region. Of course, they manipulated certain sects, and at the same time promoted a certain ideology that they presented through Arab and Muslim intellectuals as stemming from Islamic tradition, which was not the case. It was a Western creation. So these groups, starting from the 1950s onward, have always been at odds with any movement in the Arab Islamic world that was trying to break free from Western hegemony. That's why the Muslim Brothers, for example, were against Nasser, and while Nasser was negotiating the withdrawal of the British from Egypt, they tried to assassinate him, and that was in coordination with British intelligence services. Later on in the 1960s, the Americans and Saudi Arabia under King Faisal promoted certain radical Islamist groups, okay, to confront leftist and nationalist groups that were promoting an anti-Western agenda. So, this also, these groups were used, for example, in Afghanistan during the 1980s as a tool in a war by proxy by the West against the Soviet Union and against communism. So, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, these same groups were used, especially in the Arab world, and especially after 2004, when the Americans were promoting this idea of handing over power in the Arab Muslim world to these Takfiri or radical Islamist groups, let's say, that are mainly the Takfiri groups, to hand them over power in the Arab countries. And this time they promoted or let's say amended the agenda of these groups as to be Sunni, or focusing on Sunni Islam as a tool or a mean to contain what the Americans considered as Iranian Shia expansionism. So this is how these groups were used, and that was the reason why in 99% of the cases these groups never let's say targeted occupation forces, or were always let's say coping with Western agenda. And for example, in Afghanistan, the Taliban were first promoted by the United States and Pakistani intelligence, okay? But then when the United States wanted to use, let's say, or they wanted to substitute one enemy by another, they were the ones to create the image of a radical Islam that is a threat to the West, okay? But they wanted to use this in order to intervene in the region directly and redraw the geopolitical map of the region as part of their greater scheme against China and against Russia, because they consider them as the main challenger of Western hegemony. So that's why the September 11 incident, okay, we have a lot of question marks on who perpetrated these attacks, okay? And by the way, these attacks occurred only 3 months after the declaration of establishment of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization by China, Russia, and 4 Central Asian countries. And this the motto of this let's say organization was to promote stability and security in Central Asia and block any attempt by the United States to infiltrate this region. So the response was all of a sudden to use the Taliban or the war against the Taliban as a pretext. Then we had this invasion of Afghanistan, where the Americans waged a war, an aerial war actually. They didn't have boots on ground, and they supported other factions against the Taliban. Then, after the invasion of Iraq, we see that radical Islamist groups targeted the Shia rather than the occupation forces, okay, except for very limited cases. And then during the Arab Spring, we saw how these radical Islamist groups toppled Arab regime, but never targeted Western interests, or let's say never claimed to have an anti-Western agenda. And the most evident case is that of Syria, where Al-Julani, who is presented now as Ahmad al-Shara, was trained by a British company, which is intermediate, that is run by the present, by the current, actually, national security advisor in UK, to refurbish the image of Al-Julani and present him as a statesman. And the moment this group seized power, they declared that it's not of their interest or objectives to fight Israel. Okay? So, at the same time, the Americans and British who have promoted these groups are using them as a pretext to sow, let's say, division between Western societies and Arab Muslim societies by creating, let's say, a monster for them to justify all these security measures in the West, and at the same time to justify wars in the Middle East. That was very similar to what the United States and the British did prior to World War I, when influential people were among the financiers of Nazis and fascists as a tool to block communism. So this is how it's the same establishment that is promoting what we call Takfiri groups are the ones who are also promoting this Islamophobic agenda in the world.
This is so true, Professor Wakim. 3 things come to mind from what you're saying. Firstly, in the past, when someone would talk to people in the West, common citizens, to say it's the Western powers that are behind the jihadi forces. It's not a religious movement. This is a tool of the West. And they would see these as conspiracy theories. But after what's happened in Syria, no one can doubt it's in plain sight now. First of all.
Yeah.
Secondly, what you talked about in Afghanistan, the Taliban government at the time, first of all, Taliban had nothing to do with September 11, but the Taliban government was willing to negotiate sending Osama bin Laden to a third country if proof was presented, but the West didn't want to go into any negotiations.
Yeah.
Thirdly, in Libya, on this program, I talked to the former foreign minister of Malta, and he was so upset about what's happened in Libya. And he was saying that he spoke with some high people in NATO who told him that the Libyan, many tribal leaders approached NATO leaders and said, give us a little bit of time, weeks, and we will talk to Gaddafi and we will be able to convince him to hold elections and step down. But they said, no, the time is over. We're ready. We're going to attack. So what you're saying makes absolute sense.
Well, actually, there are books that were published in the West that are based on unveiled documents and sources that talk about the promotion of jihadists by Western powers. So it's no secret, and it's not a conspiracy theory, because we have solid material evidence on that, based on acknowledgement by Western powers, including the United States and the UK. And another thing, okay, at a time during the 1980s mainly, and afterwards, before that and afterwards actually, if you were an radical Islamist, you were given permission to reside in the UK and act freely. And we remember all these famous speeches by a certain sheikh who even dared to, let's say, call Queen Elizabeth to step down, because it was not allowed for a woman to be a ruler, and at the same time he called upon her to put the hijab. So, and that was in London, in a London mosque, and under the let's say under the eyes of MI5 at the time. So had these people not been sponsored by these intelligence services, they wouldn't have dared to go and use this rhetoric, which was meant actually to instigate schism between the Western societies and Muslim immigrants. And I remember when I was in Canada at one point, it was impossible for a leftist, progressive, let's say secular Arab, or let's say someone coming from a Muslim country, to ask for, let's say, to become a refugee or to be accepted as a political refugee. Whereas these radical Islamists were actually accepted as political refugees. And the latest, let's say, incident in the United States, when an Afghani, quote unquote, killed 2 security men in the United States, it turned out that this guy was a contractor with the CIA in Afghanistan, and based on this, he was granted, let's say, the green card and the refugee status in the United States, because he was affiliated with Western intelligence. And the moment he, I don't know, got angry with something, he took his gun and gunned down two servicemen in the United States. And now they are talking about Arabs, Muslims, etc., being terrorists, whereas it was their agent who turned against them and did what he did.
It's so true. I mean, I think that the trials and tribulations that the people in, especially in West Asia, have gone through, and how they have been so peaceful despite all the tragedies that they've suffered, is just amazing. And these isolated incidences that you're mentioning is so true. If you look further down into them, it shows that those people had less to do with the West or with Islam and more to do with geopolitics of the West. Professor Wakim, as someone who's not based in West Asia, but someone who has great sympathy for West Asia, I find it very depressing that when things start going, when the state weakens in any country, suddenly we have so much sectarian violence. Why is that? I read some of your articles where you're saying this has less to do with sectarianism and more to do with class struggle. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this?
Well, especially in the Arab world, okay? Well, throughout the Arab and Muslim world, and even in all countries, there are always, let's say, partial or local identities, regional identities, sectarian identities. And at the same time, there is a national identity that could join everybody or gather everybody under its banner. So what's going on is that the West is using these sectarian conflicts, or is instigating sectarian conflicts and trying to use them as under his strategy of divide and rule in order to, let's say, weaken these the countries, the Arab or Muslim countries, and either control them or divide them. This had been the case during the Lebanese civil war, for example. Now it's being attempted in Syria. Too bad when the government that takes over power is not aware of the rights of various groups, okay, it would lead to this conflict, the way is happening in Syria. But at the same time, we need to see this paper that is published online, it's not a secret, by the former Security Council of Ariel Sharon, the former defense minister of the Zionist entity back in 1982, when he published his paper. His name is Oded Yenon, and the paper is famous by his own name, the paper of the paper of Oded Yenon, where he talks about dividing Arab countries of the Levant, mainly Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and even Egypt, in order to first weaken the Arab countries, and at the same time to promote confessional and sectarian identities that could become complementary to Israel, that is based on an imaginary religious identity. Okay? So this is why we see that the West is instigating tension between the various sectarian groups. And for example, while I'm saying this, okay, For example, well, I myself am Christian, but during the Civil War, I was against the let's say Christians or Christian leaders who were collaborating with Israel, because and I reject this tension between Christians and Muslims. For example, because I know that it's instigated by the West to undermine the sovereignty of our countries on one hand, and at the same time to damage the interests of both Muslims and Christians. Later on, it was this conflict between Shia and Sunni that was also generated by the West, and it came at the expense of the interests of the Shia and Sunnis, whether in Lebanon, Syria, or even Iraq. Okay? So, this is how we need to see things. And we need to be aware of the fact that we, for thousands of years, we have been all, let's say, we belong to the same civilization, pluralist civilization, under the Umayyads, Abbasids, and other dynasties that succeeded one another in ruling the Muslim world or part of it. We saw, for example, Christians being wazir, being high officials, doctors, scientists, also Shia Muslims or Sunni Muslims. So we need to see or to review our history, okay, and see how under one banner all these factions, all these sects, all these groups contributed to the flourishing of this civilization, and why the West is trying to instigate troubles. Okay, sometimes in some countries it's between maybe Sunni Christians and Muslims. In other countries it's between Sunnis and Shia, where we have 100%, let's say, Sunni population. We see how the Americans are trying to instigate tension between various tribes, mainly in the Gulf region, the Arab Gulf region. You know, I mean the countries, the Arab countries of the Gulf region, and we see how, for example, in some other places, they instigate tension between Arabs and non-Arabs, like between Arabs and Kurds. In the Maghreb region, they instigate tension between the Berbers and the Arabs, and all this for one reason, which is to divide and rule and to lead our societies to self-destruction.
So absolutely true. Professor Wakim, with all of these things that you've mentioned, how do you see the stability of the Syrian government now? Do you think this is like a transition period to another change that will be coming in Syria and might bring more stability and will be more long lasting? Or do you think the current government has grassroots support enough to keep it in position in Syria for a long time?
Well, the ones who are in power now in Syria are mainly supported by the Turks. And by the way, for example, Erdogan is playing a very negative role, whether in the Arab region or in the Transcaucasus and Central Asia, on behalf of the West. So as they have support from Turkey. I don't know to what extent this could allow this group to maintain power, and at the same time, there is British and American and Israeli support for this group who is in power. At the same time, the Israelis are trying to use what the current, let's say, authority in Damascus is doing against other religious groups in order to sow division and at the same time promote among these groups certain people who would call for protection from Israel, the way this Sheikh al-Hijri did in the Druze area, or the way that Qasad are doing in northeastern Syria. And all this fall within one plan promoted by Israel, the way it's mentioned in the Hodidianon document, to divide Syria into various entities based on sectarian and confessional affiliation.
Yes. How do you see this tension that appears to be brewing up between Turkey and Israel over Syria? How much substance do you think that has? And ultimately, because they're both allies of the US and of the West,
Yeah.
do you see this kind of rolling out?
Well, we know very well that it was this Turkish-Israeli collaboration that allowed al-Julani to take over power.
Yes.
So, and the both Turkey and Israel wanted to divide Syria into zones of influence. The problem is that Erdogan have fallen into the Israeli trap in the sense that now these groups, because Israel wants to divide Syria into various sub-entities. The original deal between them was to, let's say, share influence, okay? But as Israel wants to divide Syria, it might be leading to the establishment of a Kurdish zone in northern Syria, and this could encourage the Kurds of Turkey, who are around 20 million, concentrated in the eastern part of the country, to follow suit and call for independence. And this will divide Turkey itself. So that's why there was this, let's say, I don't call it a conflict, but it's a sort of trying to coordinate or draw the lines between Turkish influence and Israeli influence in Syria now.
Yes. And Professor Wakim, also, quite often in your writings, you talk about these conflicts in the context of great power rivalry. And you've also mentioned, I believe, that you've mentioned that the conflict between Russia and NATO or the West will ultimately be settled not in Eastern Europe, but in the Middle East. What do you mean by that?
Well, based on precedents in previous global conflicts, the Middle East is the main arena that could decide the war. So that's why it was, and actually, this was part of a speech that I made in Moscow 8 months prior to the collapse of the Syrian regime. It never crossed my mind at the time that the regime would collapse. And I know very well I had a lot of, let's say, criticism for the previous regime. But I knew what it fought for. And I had concerns that the Russians, while concentrating on Ukraine, might be undermining the importance of or the geopolitical importance of Syria, especially for Russian national security. That was why I made the speech and I wrote an article. And then, after the collapse of the regime, we saw how the United States, being satisfied with its, let's say, achievement in Syria, was able to concentrate its efforts to allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territories. And we remember these attacks against strategic bases in various parts of Russia. Okay? And at the same time, it was the collapse of the Syrian regime that allowed Israel and the United States to concentrate their power in June 2025 to attack Iran itself in an attempt to topple the regime. And had they been successful in assassinating the supreme leader, Imam Khamenei, they would have achieved their objective. However, they were short of achieving all of their objectives, and mainly assassinating Imam Khamenei, which allowed Iran to, let's say, contain the situation and retaliate to the aggression. But now, the United States are benefiting from their position in the Levant in order to concentrate their efforts on the Trans-Caucasus. And this explains how they were able to force Armenia and Azerbaijan into an agreement in order to use them as a bridgehead in their attempt to get to the other shore of the Caspian Sea and instigate instability in Central Asia, which would undermine the national security of Russia on one hand, and China and Iran on the other hand. So, in my opinion, the Russians need to recuperate what they have lost in Syria, and the Iranians too. Otherwise, we might see another attempt by the Israelis to strike deep into Iran in an attempt to not only to topple the regime, but to divide Iran into various states. And we know how the Americans are instigating separatist movements, whether in Mahabad region, in eastern Azerbaijan, and in Baluchistan. Okay, so that's why I see that either the Iranians strike back and try to, well, alongside the Russians, recuperate what they have lost in the Levant, or they would have to defend themselves within their own countries.
And Professor, I was saying, if you look at this conflict that's going on in Gaza, the long genocide, so many lives lost in Gaza, in Lebanon, what's happening between Israel and Yemen, what's happened in Syria. If you look at it from like a broad perspective, and if things were even to stop, the war is to stop now, who do you think has gained and who do you think has lost out? And also I'm thinking about regional realignments. There's been this defense agreement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Recently in Pakistan, there was visits from top IRGC and other politicians from Iran. There was visits from top security officers from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia. So there's a lot of realignments going on as well. So if you look at it, who do you think has weakened and who do you think has come out stronger than before and in long term, including Hezbollah as well?
Well, we need to admit reality that after the developments of the past 2 years, well, The Israelis and the Americans have achieved major victories. Okay, they have directed severe blows against the Palestinian resistance, the Lebanese resistance, and most important, they were able to topple the regime that, despite all its, let's say, deficiencies, was a regime that was supporting the resistance and that was confronting Israel. And we see the impact of its collapse now, how it affected the whole balance of power and made it tilt drastically to the favor of Israel in the region. Iran has lost, okay? I mean, or injured losses, in the sense that the battle is still going on. Russia has injured losses, mainly in losing a major ally in the region, in Syria. But now, Western powers, and mainly the West, the United States, and Israel, are targeting Iran one more time. They couldn't wipe out the resistance, the Palestinian resistance in Lebanon. That is predominantly Sunni. And this is how, in our rhetoric, we need to see the bigger picture and not go into details that would blind us from seeing reality. Okay? At the same time, it was the situation of the resistance Lebanon, which is predominantly Shia resistance. It's also precarious. Okay? And now the United States is targeting both Shia Iran, or predominantly Shia Iran, and the predominantly Sunni Pakistan. Okay? And this is, by the way, they are using not only Israel, but also the United Arab Emirates as, let's say, local allies to promote their agenda. Now there is an alliance between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv in the Middle East, and everybody else is sensing the threat, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Iran. Turkey is playing a very, let's say, mainly Erdogan is playing a very hypocrite role. He's trying to gain from both camps at the same time, but we see how UAE is instigating instability in Sudan, in Libya, and in other parts of the Arab and African world, to the favor of the United States and to the favor of Israel. How the UAE is allying itself to India against Pakistan, and this explains why Pakistan is trying to make up for this by strengthening its ties to both Iran and Saudi Arabia. At the same time, we see how Turkey, that is playing a dual role, is instigating troubles in Afghanistan by creating this schism between Kabul and Islamabad. Okay, but behind all this, we need to see the plan of the United States and Israel to redraw the whole geopolitical map of the greater Middle East in order to fit their new agenda for the region, to maintain hegemony at minimal cost, and at the same time use the region as a stepping stone against Iran, Russia, and China, who are considered as the powers that control the heartland of Eurasia.
It's interesting, Professor Wakim, that every conflict, it seems like almost every conflict we look at, whether that's in Sudan or what's happening between India and Pakistan or Iran, Syria, Yemen, UAE seems to be behind everything.
Because it was granted this role, by the United States and by Israel. The UAE, with its own potentials, cannot play this role. But it's been used as a facade for Israel and the United States in various parts of the world. Because if Israel wants to infiltrate an Islamic country, it's very hard for it to do this.
Yeah.
Whereas when it does this via Emirates, which is accepted as an Arab-Islamic country, then things would become much easier for Israel.
Yes, true. Professor Wakim, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it, especially on a Sunday. I've kept you away from your family and friends and your rest day for such a long time. I really appreciate your analysis,
My pleasure.
your insights. Before you go, would you like to tell us a bit about you? You write quite a lot of articles. Where can people follow your work?
Well, I write articles and they are usually posted on various websites, and my interviews are on YouTube so far until I get banned. So, and I don't know.
Please do share any links of articles or websites, and I'll put them on the show notes. So if
I'll do my best. Thank you very much. Well, maybe this interview encourages me one more time to translate my articles from Arabic into English so that I could address a wider audience.
definitely, I think that's such a good idea. And if there's anything I can do to help, I'll be honored to.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good day. Thank you so much. Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode.